Most of us have probably heard the name Emily Dickinson at some point in our lifetimes, especially if we're American. And that is because Emily Dickinson is one of the most prolific and famous American poets, despite being born and dying in the 19th century. Many of her works are still relevant today, and I would still call her a household name in American society. One of the most recent reimaginations of Dickinson is Dickinson as a queer artist. And part of what makes her work so relevant and how it continues to stay so relevant is because people can reimagine her over and over and over again and continue to see the multitude of possibilities within her work. This imagination of Dickinson as a queer artist has grown in popularity, and I would say it's brought new worth, new meaning, and new audiences to her work. But why do some people push back against it? And why do some people heavily cling to it? That's what we're going to get into today. So settle in, cozy up, and grab a nice warm beverage, because we're going to talk about Dickinson as a queer artist and all of the controversy and conversation that surrounds that. Before we truly start dissecting the meaning and worth within this interpretation of Dickinson as a queer artist, we have to define our terms, because a lot of them either aren't used in everyday life or are used in different ways. The first term that I'm going to define is literary canon, and if you don't frequent academic circles or read a lot of academic articles, then this might be a very odd term to you. It was a very odd term to me before I went to college. I honestly had no idea what it meant. But literary canon is essentially the standard of classification, or just a standard in general, for literature. And works in literary canon kind of define what a standard for good literature is. The problem with that is that someone has to make these decisions of what is classic literature, what gets to be the standard. And for a long time, the people who made those decisions were white men, particularly European or American white men. So there are definitely identities that are not represented within the classic literary canon. And that's what these readings of classical artists as queer or as radical are trying to push back against. They're trying to diversify the literary canon. The second word is queer. And queer can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And some people might be understandably and validly very reluctant to use it because of how it has been used hatefully against the LGBTQ community. However, it is the term that's connected to queer theory in the queer lens, which we'll talk about in a second, so that's why I'm using it in today's video. Queer is a broad umbrella term, and according to Vanderbilt University, it is a term referring to all non-heterosexual people. And for the purposes of this video today, we're going to be talking about queer in terms of the sexuality aspect, that this is a non-heteronormative sexuality, and how Dickinson's work might contribute to that. Our next term is queer theory and queer readings. And queer theory is, to quote the Library Research Guide, an interdisciplinary field that encourages one to look at the world through new avenues. It is a way of thinking that dismantles traditional assumptions about gender and sexual identities. So that's how we're going to be using it in the video today. These queer theories, these queer readings are looking at ways that Emily Dickinson did not conform to traditional heteronormative standards, especially in 19th century America, and kind of where that happened, why that happened, and what meaning is there within that. Our last word is erasure. Erasure is a term referring to the underrepresentation of certain people groups and identities just in general in media, but also in the literary canon, and that's how we're going to be using it. Erasure in the literary canon, and then also diversifying the literary canon through and using queer readings. Erasure can refer to racial erasure, so erasing narratives from people of color, but it can also refer to gender erasure, erasing narratives from women, and erasure of sexuality, erasing narratives from queer individuals. For example, if a book is written by a queer woman, then it's less likely to be taken seriously than a book written by a queer man, and it might also experience some more forms of censorship. So that's how we're using erasure. And whenever we talk about Emily Dickinson being queer and erasure in the literary canon, we're talking much more in depth about how her work is pushing back against society and the worth that is found within that. Her poetry opens up new avenues to queer people when they're able to read it queerly, And it also might even provide a more honest depiction of who Emily Dickinson was. Of course, there's a problematic aspect of queer theory. If you're not careful, you can assign sexuality to people who, like Emily Dickinson, have no way of saying, yes, I agree, or no, I'm really uncomfortable with that. We do know that Emily was a very private person. She had some reluctance to be published, and she did not really want to be in the public sphere all that much. Referring to the poem, I'm Nobody, Who Are You? She kind of embraced a little bit of privateness. She might have been very uncomfortable with some of these readings of her as a queer artist. She also might have been very uncomfortable with her personal letters and correspondence being published. However, they are published and people read them, so people interpret them. Saying that we want Dickinson to remain sexually ambiguous does not mean that Dickinson is a straight author or straight poet. It simply means that we do not know whether she was queer or straight, but we can acknowledge that there were some queer themes in her letters, in her poetry, and maybe even in her life. With all of that said, what do Emily Dickinson's poems actually say? To kind of cover the queer interpretations of her poems, we're going to look at two: Wild Nights and Her Breast Was Fit for Pearls. These two poems have been read very explicitly queerly and for very, I think, clear reasons. I'm going to read an excerpt from Wild Nights first. Wild nights, were I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury. And then in the last stanza, rowing in Eden, ah, the sea, might I but more tonight in thee. Now, unlike Her Breast Was Fit for Pearls, this poem does not assign a gender to who the recipient of this poem would be. It simply expresses a desire to more in thee, in this other person. And it is intimate, it is sensual, and people have read this as a queer work because of that deeply sensual and intimate feeling, and because of the relationship that Dickinson had to her sister-in-law, Sue. She wrote many, many letters to Sue, some of which were very heavily, I want to use the term queer-coded, that it would be very easy to read them and assume that there was some romantic intention. And so this poem kind of reflects the same passion, the same desire, the same intensity. And that would be why people interpret it queerly, and also because they might read it and think, oh, this is how I feel about the person that I love, and I wish that we could, as the second stanza says, be done with the compass, done with the chart, done with life, and kind of just rest in the peace and love that we find in each other as queer people. That is a reading that is valid but relates more to personal experience. The queer reading would be that this personal and sensual poem is pushing back against a kind of heteronormative sense. Her Breast Was Fit for Pearls, but I Was Not a Diver is more explicitly queer in some senses because it uses she, her pronouns for the object of the poem, and Dickinson wrote it, and Dickinson identified as a woman. Her Breast Is Fit for Pearls uses terms like her breast, her brow, her heart, and it talks about finding home in a person despite not being the quote-unquote perfect match. For example, the first line, her breast was fit for pearls, but I was not a diver. The speaker is saying that they couldn't provide what the object of the poem might deserve. However, at the end of the poem, her heart is fit for home, I, a sparrow, build there, sweet of twigs and twine, my perennial nest. It's saying that despite the flaws, there is still home that we find within each other. And this can be read very queerly as rejecting the traditional idea that this needs to be a perfect relationship, this needs to adhere to societal standards, that she would need a man to provide for her in the 19th century. They are still in love, they are still able to rest and live together and be whole. That opens up this poem to new audiences to relate to their own personal life, but also to say, hey, this traditional standard doesn't have to be the standard. This can be wonderful and lovely without adhering to that. It can really easily be read as queer love is beautiful. And queer readings of Dickinson aren't new, even though they've risen in popularity. An article from the 1970s by Dorothy Lodridge calls Dickinson bisexual, homosexual, etc. Now, this author of the article did due to her position in time and possibly her own beliefs about sexuality, use very Freudian and what we would call outdated language. In her words, lack of adequate emotional relationship to both parents in her early childhood placed the poet in an essentially bisexual position that seems to have resolved itself into homosexual inclinations. Now that, in a 21st century standard, is an absolutely crazy, wild thing to say, that she was forced into an essentially bisexual position because of a lack of adequate emotional relationship with her parents. But that is probably what would be the common belief of what causes queerness at the time. It's not new. And she goes on to interpret her poems and see how these quote-unquote homosexual inclinations appear in her work. And it's very interesting. It's also heavily outdated, and it's not how queer readings happen today. In 2009, K.N. Comment wrote an article examining the worth of queer readings, especially in an educational concept, which to some states, Florida, might be very scary. Comment remarks on a time in their classroom when a student asked if Emily Dickinson was a lesbian, and the regret they feel for not expanding on that. And the reason I feel I should have expanded is that these conversations are worthwhile. Queer readings of Dickinson provide an opportunity to include more diverse perspectives and conversations when talking about classical literature or the literary canon. So Comment's position is that these conversations are worthwhile and important because they diversify the literary canon. But in 2018, Annelise Brinck-Johnsen argued against that, but suggested applying queer theory to read how poets like Emily Dickinson portray time in a non-traditional, non-heteronormative sense. Now, whenever I read the abstract for that article, I was confused. I didn't know what it meant to queerify time. It is a very interesting concept. It's not exactly the most applicable concept, but she really pushes against these traditional queer readings, which feels kind of like an oxymoron. These queer readings of Dickinson that try to assign sexuality, because in her mind it is flawed and it relies too heavily on modern concepts of sexual orientation. In her words, quote, "We must consider the trouble at the very heart of the word queer, a word that is both an umbrella term used for sexualities that are not heterosexual and a word that is meant to question the notion of categorizing those sexualities to begin with." So she's really kind of skeptical about using these 21st century terms for Emily Dickinson, but she is very explicitly interested in how Dickinson's work, as well as a few other female poets, works to, quote, queer time, and how that non-traditional writing of time is worthwhile and important. And it is actually very, very interesting, even if it did make me feel like my head was spinning a little bit whenever I was reading it. And in 2022, Emily Cokia invited readers to go beyond Dickinson and other wealthy white women as a means of creating a, quote, queer genealogy, unquote, in favor of being ready to accept women of color into the queer genealogy and literary canon. She warns against too close reading, which involves projection of your own ideals. And she would really advise that there are valuable queer writers today, there are valuable queer people of color today that have been otherwise limited from access to being critically acclaimed. But regardless of the reservations of some academic scholars, popular audiences are really heavily invested in this idea of Dickinson as a queer artist, and I think that that's important. I think that that's valuable. It is a new lens for someone who otherwise hasn't seen queer people in history. It provides new opportunities for people to converse what it means to be queer in the 21st century and what it meant to be queer in the 19th century. And these queer readings are only growing more popular. On Twitter, or X, to be honest, I don't really know what to call it since the branding change. User @FairyDreamness posted, "Emily Dickinson really wrote to Sue, I tore open your letter and licked the envelope seal for any lingering taste of you. And historians thought they were just friends." Now, while that poster is being very obviously a little bit comical about it, it does reflect the real feeling of, oh, historians just try to kind of erase queer people. And it makes it obvious that the poster thinks that Dickinson was obviously queer, that that's how these things should be read. Despite that, there are people who have reservations on that. In response to a question on the site Quora, Robert Stanford a commenter replied that her sexuality doesn't matter, that they should be unconcerned about it because what matters is her poetry. And his view would be that her personal life should not impact how we read her poetry. Similar to @FairyDreams on Twitter, or X, is a poster on Tumblr who said, "One of my favorite feelings in the world is starting an older piece of media that you have heard is gay and being excited, but like, oh, it's probably going to be subtextual, and then it ends up being very in your face obvious." And so that is kind of going back to that feeling of, obviously this poet had queer inclinations, obviously this poet did not live life in the traditional heteronormative way. This poster is also very clear that they probably wouldn't have read Emily Dickinson if it weren't for Dickinson being kind of marketed as a queer poet, or being told that Dickinson had queer inclinations. And that's one of the main reasons why queer readings are important. Beyond the added worth that queer readings add, they also open up Emily Dickinson's poetry to new people, new audiences, and those audiences have new and unique things to say that if you just keep on having your poetry read by straight white men, it's not going to be said. These conversations generate buzz around Emily Dickinson and continue to make her relevant in today's society. An informational article posted by Gaiety analyzed the historical context and reasons why queer readings might have been suppressed. So not only is this interpreting Dickinson as a queer artist, but it's also going into, okay, so we're talking about Emily Dickinson, we're talking about how she might be queer, let's talk about why that might have been hidden. And that is a very important conversation to have, especially in an age where there is so much media all the time that you are consuming. What media is being suppressed and why might it be suppressed? But beyond being personally able to relate to people and also getting into these academic conversations, why do these queer readings matter? Well, it also allows for people to put them in conversation not only with their own lives, but with different poets, writers, lyricists. Because these queer readings often relate to her expression of desire and longing and her want for intimacy, they can be put in conversation with contemporary artists that people also view as expressing those same emotions, such as Hozier. But beyond that, there have been several modern adaptations of Dickinson and her life that take varying different stances. The director of A Quiet Passion, Terence Davies, did not view her sexuality as being relevant, as in his main concern was that he expressed that she felt unrequited love, not focusing on the actual sexuality. Conversely, Wild Nights with Emily is very explicitly queer, as is Apple TV's Dickinson. Now, Apple TV's Dickinson is very anachronistic. It doesn't follow what was actually accurate for that time period, but it's not really concerned with being accurate to the time period as much as it's concerned with exploring ideas of how Emily Dickinson might have thought of these things if she was in a 21st century context. But it also gets a little bit fuzzy on that, and that's brought up some very negative sentiment from people who enjoy Dickinson. One reviewer said, "Oh, and of course Emily is gay or bisexual. This must be for the younger generations. I don't know, just don't see anything good here." And a major part of that is due to the queer reading. So of course, while these queer readings open up a large avenue of audiences to being willing to accept and read and explore Dickinson, they also have the opportunity to shut Dickinson away. Now, you get into the question of which readings are worth more. And my opinion is that readings that explore new thoughts, new avenues, are worth more. And readings that seek to diversify the literary canon are worthy. The more that people can interpret and read readings and poetry in different ways, the more that the human experience is defined, explored, the more depth that can be found. And it's what continues to keep Emily Dickinson relevant. If her work wasn't able to be adapted to a 21st century context, then people would not be talking about it as much as they are now. Her work is still relevant, and a large part of that is because people say, hey, queer readings are important to me, they're important to this audience. And this poet from the 19th century, this prolific poet, shares our inclinations, or can be read as sharing our inclinations, and adds meaningful insight to what it means to be queer. So while these reservations are worthwhile, ultimately these new queer readings add depth to Emily Dickinson's character and legacy and continue to allow her to live on in the American mindset and in the literary canon, while also adding diversity within that. Does that mean that we shouldn't focus on queer people today and their voices? Absolutely not. And that doesn't mean that we should only focus on Dickinson as a queer artist. All of these readings are valid and add worth and meaning, and they continue to put her in new conversations and new scenarios and allow her to be reimagined. But those are my thoughts. What do you guys think? Comment down below if you agree, if you disagree, or if you would like to nuance this a little bit. One of the main purposes of this channel is to allow space for conversation outside of literary journals or college classrooms. So let's talk about it. Thank you so much. If you liked this video, please subscribe, comment, give it a like, and I'll see you whenever I put a new video out. Have a great week.